We're very grateful today to Paula Meehan, who's made time to come and read her poems for us and talk about them, to talk about Painting Rain, that we discussed a little bit last week. Sorry, is it? No? That we discussed a little bit last week in the lecture. So what we're going to do is we're going to have sort of part conversation and part reading. So we'll be moving in and out of the poems and the discussion as we go along. I know a few of you have sent in some questions, so we hope certainly to incorporate those in the discussion. So I'd like to begin by thinking a little bit about ideas of influence, and by asking you, Paula, who you would say the most important influences are on your work. This book, of course, mentions Evan Boland, Seamus Heaney, Michael Hartnett. Could you talk a bit more about that issue of influence?
Well, the names you've mentioned, can you hear me? Is the sound system working? Might be working a bit better now, yeah? When the button is pressed, of course. The names that you've mentioned, Seamus Heaney, Evan Boland, whom this book is dedicated, Painting Rain, and Michael Hartnett, they were the living community of poets that I found as I began my own journey into writing, making the poems and publishing them. We live on quite a small island, and eventually, if you move into the writing world, you eventually meet up with some of your heroes and heroines. So they were the living community that I met and admired. But I think there's two kinds of influence for a poet. One is what you absorb through your life, sometimes through education. The poets that you read in school, that maybe you're put under a certain amount of pressure. There's a kind of fetish of meaning. What does the poet mean? Seemed to always reverberate through my education. What does the poet mean here? Could you express it in your own words? As if poets were trying to kind of put one over on you, that they had designs on confusing you. So there's what you absorb through your education, but there's also what comes in what is your zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and the spirit of my age when I was a teenager and starting to get into writing poems, where the influences were coming through music and through, if you like, poetry that was coming through us on the street. So the music would have been those great singer-songwriters of the 70s, Dylan, Cohen, Joni Mitchell, who's just celebrated her 74th birthday last week. So those songwriters were hugely influential. They carried the lyric tradition. I think song is the sister act to lyric poetry. So if you like, the commingling of what came to me about the tradition, nuances and hints from the tradition, and what came to me from the streets really was were the influential and also inspiring elements, because it's not that you sit down and look for a theory of poetry or a theory of literature. It is something that you experience in the body as well as the mind. So the actual magic incantatory nature of poetry was probably the most influential thing when I was starting out.
Could I just pick up on the issue of, you were talking about the zeitgeist and kind of picking things from the streets, if you like. Could you say a bit about the difference between Ireland as an influence and maybe more international figures, either among poets or other writers or musicians?
Well, there were two streams, if you like, coming at me when I was young. One was the cultural influences coming in from America, especially from the west coast of America, from that generation of poets probably known, who started to publish in the 50s. People that, I mean, it was a generation that was sometimes characterized by the word beat, the beat poets, Ginsberg, especially Gary Snyder, the great ecologist, Buddhist poet. So they were huge influences, and they came in as part of the zeitgeist. We certainly weren't studying them in school. And from the other direction, from Europe, there was the publication of the Penguin Modern European Poets. So it meant we were getting poets in translation for the first time. And I was especially influenced by the poetry coming out of what's called the Silver Age of Russian poetry. So they were poets like Anna Akhmatova, Marina Tsvetaeva, Boris Pasternak, and Osip Mandelstam. And one of Mandelstam's poems actually became almost for me like a prayer. I see him as a kind of a saint of poetry. He was persecuted by Stalin. He was arrested in, I think, about 1938 and sent to the Gulag. And he disappeared in transit between one work camp and another. And nobody knows exactly what happened to him. They say he was thrown off the truck that was taking him from one gulag to another, and that he was eaten by wolves. Now that to me sounds like the folk imagination, because if you disappear in the Siberian wilderness, of course you'd be eaten by wolves. And there's a poem which I'll say for you that has become a kind of a prayer. And in it, at the heart of Osip Mandelstam's poem, is this beautiful image of making your mark in your own breath on the window pane. And I'm sure these frosty mornings, many of us will have done that, where you breathe on the window pane and you make your mark in your own breath. So it's a beautiful emblem of what poets do. They make their mark with their own breath. And I'll say the poem for you. What shall I do with this body that has been given to me, so much at one with me, so much my own? For the calm happiness of breathing, tell me where should I be grateful? I am garden and gardener too, and not alone in this vast dungeon. My breath, my mark, you can already see on the window pane of eternity. A lovely pattern, unseen till now, is revealed there. So let the muddle die down, let the sediment run out. The lovely pattern cannot be wiped out. And I think poetry, especially when you're starting off to make poems, it can seem like a very intangible, illusory, vague thing to do with your life. And to some degree, your family might encourage that attitude. You know, when I was growing up, one of the questions coming at me all the time is, well, used to be, what is all this education for? And that then became, what was all that education for? Because the life of a poet, it doesn't necessarily bring financial reward. And as a young one from a working class background, you know, education was seen as a way of making a jump into the middle classes and to a better standard of living and a car and a house and all the things that come with, you know, better living conditions. And here was I, like, writing poetry, penniless. You know, what was all that education for was a very valid question in the community I come from. So you have to kind of negotiate these waters, and they can be stormy waters. So that poem, that act of faith, meant so much to me as a young writer, that yes, you know, you let the lovely pattern cannot be wiped out. And literary history teaches us that no matter how tough the actual making and survival as a writer, that the pattern you make is what you're in the game for, and what you make is entrusted to the world.
Could I just pick up on the idea of a public role for poetry from that? Because this idea that the text is sort of entrusted to the world. You've talked elsewhere about poetry as a public utterance. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, a bit, especially now in this moment. Is there a sense that there is a role for the poet to speak of politics, to speak of contemporary events?
It's paradoxical, I think, that question, because sometimes the most political act you can make and the most public act you can make is to be absolutely faithful to your own private concerns. Because we're creatures of community, we're citizens of the state. I often think that if I want to talk about the effect that the state has on me, then if I write about my most intimate relationships, I have a better chance of doing that, of succeeding in it, than if I try and write some abstract, if you like, theory of what oppresses me. So I sometimes think by examining the actual details of your life, you're more likely to understand, if you like, the macro context for your life by a close examination of what's going on inside you. So while I think I wouldn't advocate a kind of a facile political engagement, because I mean, isn't that the language of politics? Isn't that the language we distrust? The rhetoric of politics. But I think there is a place for private witness. And that poem I quoted by Osip Mandelstam, I mean, he wasn't writing, pull down the barricade, pull down the institutions, man the barricades, woman the barricades. He wasn't writing a poetry like that. He was writing a private lyric of nature rapture, of love poetry in the lyric tradition. But yet, Stalin, the great dictator, he was completely fixated on these poets, the lyric poets. He saw them as a complete danger to the structures of the Stalinist state, what communism had become in the Stalinist terror. So I'm very interested in that, even in the present day, how a private act of witness can be so threatening to the public rhetoric in a way that no amount of political rhetoric ever will be. So I think there still is a place for the private witness. And in the 20th century, where there's so many, what another Russian poet called a terrible century, so many wars, so many instances of genocide, the actual making of a private act of witness becomes a political act.
Is this a moment to read a few of your poems to speak of that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I thought I might start with a couple of poems that really reference my grandparents. First, in one directly and one less directly, if I can find the page now. And the first one I read concerns my grandmother, Hannah. Oh, gosh. Sorry now. So 46. So Hannah and my grandfather, they were both born in an area of Dublin, a very historic, colourful area of Dublin, called the Monto, and it was the biggest red light district in Europe at the turn of the century into the 20th century. And Hannah was, I found her in the 1911 census, the online census, and she was 6 years of age, living in what was called Lower Tyrone Street. City Council changed the names of those streets to wipe out the memory of it being the biggest red light district in Europe. I was very lucky. My parents were emigrants in the 50s to London, and I was left with my grandparents. So I had that extraordinary benefit and blessing of spending all that time with my grandparents, who treated me as the absolute centre of the universe and spoiled me rotten. So I went around the town with Hannah a lot, back to the old neighbourhood, to the shops, to the churches. She spent a lot of her life on her knees in front of the Madonna, as I say in the poem. She was a very pious woman, but she was that curious mixture of devotion and piety and rampant anti-clericalism. Because the church in the, if you like, in her youth would have been very opposed to the labour movement. So at one stage excommunicating the labour leaders. So she would have had that mixture of, which was common enough in the inner city, of devotion and piety to the precepts of the Catholic Church, and yet this hatred of the priests. So this poem comes out of that conundrum. So Hannah, grandmother. And I should say it was written against the backdrop of the publication of the Ryan report into clerical sex abuse of minors. Coldest day yet of November, her voice close in my ear. Tell them priests nothing. Was I 12, 13? Filthy minded. Keep your sins to yourself. Don't be giving them a thrill, dirty old feckers. As close as she came to the birds and the bees, on her knees in front of the Madonna, Our Lady of the Facts of Life, beside the confessional, oak door closing like a coffin lid, neatly carpentered, waxed and buffed. In the well-made box of these poems, her voice dies. She closes her eyes and lowers her brow to her joined hands, prays hard, woman to woman. So that remembers Hannah, my grandmother. Her husband, Walter, or known familiarly as Watty, was my grandfather, and I found him too in the 1911 census, entered twice by his mother and his father at two different addresses and with two different ages, which only goes to prove that, in fact, the census, while it's a wonderful instrument for historians, also in certain areas, certainly in inner city Dublin, has to be taken with a large grain of salt. And especially an area like Monto, where truth is a commodity that must be examined and looked at, historical truth especially. So this poem is a sonnet. It's called A Remembrance of My Grandfather Watty, who taught me to read and write, which is true. He did. He with great patience, taught me to read and write. But it's actually dedicated to Seamus Heaney for his 70th birthday. We couldn't have been aware that he was going to be gone from us in a scant 4 years from his 70th birthday. But I made this as a kind of toy, so it's a bit show-offy. You know, I wanted to say, here's a sonnet, aren't I great? It's full of moves and shifts and shapes. And so it is seen, I did design it as a playful thing. And it references, of course, and I'm sure you've probably come across this, it references his home place, Derry, which is the place of the oaks. You know, in our native tongue, D is Der, and it has, every letter of the Irish language has a symbiotic relationship with a tree, which is one of the loveliest things. And it's not as if the letter is a symbol of the tree or a tree is a symbol of the letter. I don't know, maybe somewhere in the back of the mind it sees the island, or it holds the island in memory as a forested place. You know, the great oaks were cut down by the Elizabethans to build their ships and to smelt the ore for the iron. So I liked that idea that I would play around with that, Derry and Der, and of course at the root of the word druid is the same, those who go into the oak groves for their mysteries. But also the sonnet, because I don't really use the received forms, the patterns that are handed down. I don't think that necessarily makes a better poem. But I like the karma of those forms, you know, the inherited forms. And for an Irish woman in the 21st century writing a sonnet, there are kind of, for me, interesting ironies. Firstly, the irony that it was, you know, it came into our culture through, from the Sicilian, well, from the Italian, by that generation of Elizabethan poets, Raleigh and Spenser and Wyatt, the court poets of Elizabeth I, the very same guys who landed into Ireland and went rampaging through the countryside, through Munster, putting the end of the Gaelic order to the sword. So it carries a lot of interest for me as a form, the karma of it. But this is a remembrance of my grandfather, Watty, who taught me to read and write. Heading towards the Natural History Museum, across the snowy paths of Merrion Square, the city hushed, the park deserted, in a daydream I look up. A heaving net of branches, leaf bare against the pearly sky, there like a trireme on an opalescent ocean, or some creature of the upper air come down to nest, a cargo with a forest meme, only begotten of gall, of pulp, of page, of leaf light, of feather. What snagged that book in the high reaches of the oak? A child let out of school, casting heavenward the dreary yoke, an eco-installation from an artist of the avant-garde, or the book's own deep need to be with kindred, a rootling cradled again in grandfather's arms, freed of her history, her spells, her runes, her fading charms.
Interestingly, this was one of the poems that we discussed a bit last week in the lecture, and one of the things I was interested in this poem is this, obviously, the bridging of the textual and the ecological. And the ecological is a big theme in this book as a whole. There's quite a lot of connections, I think, between landscape and the natural world and the writing process. So could you talk a bit more about environmental issues in your work and how they influence you?
Okay, I suppose I might actually answer that question best, and I have to say thank you very much for the questions, which were superb and demanding, and many of them were unanswerable in the sense that my life in writing is a total experiment and exploration, and every single time I sit down to the blank page, I sit down in a state of doubt, uncertainty, and with a certain sense of excitement that I'm going to make something up and discover something. But it is always exploratory, and even my conclusions are temporary, because there's always something that challenges certainty. And I love that. I like to be in that zone of uncertainty, because that's what drives me to actually write. So I think in terms of dealing with that, ideas around text and context, if you like, and the environment, I'll read a poem that came out directly out of what I witnessed during the boom times, because this book is to some degree a creature of the Celtic tiger. I was watching that happen as I wrote these poems, and it was always the undersong, the kind of crazy stuff when you turned on the radio, and even when you were around the place talking to neighbours, you know, buying timeshares in Bulgaria and, you know, mortgaging unimaginable amounts. It seemed to be that a lot of your personal worth in those days was signified by how much you owed. I heard boasting competitions amongst people about how much they owed. And, you know, it had that feeling that it was all going to come tumbling down for sure. So this poem is called Death of a Field. And in that time, which I think, you know, we're beginning to see elements of it again, you know, people didn't sell houses and gardens anymore. They sold houses and sites. So it seemed like every small piece of land was suddenly looked at with avaricious eyes, despite consequence. So this is about an actual field that was behind my house where I live in Baldoyle, a beautiful small coastal meadow. And suddenly then it was part of this deal between the council, developers, the local school, and it must have been some of the worst housing that was ever built in Ireland. I mean, including maybe some of the most expensive housing that was ever built. The roofs had to be replaced twice. They had to dig up the plumbing. I mean, it was a nightmare. Fire regulations were totally disregarded. So, I mean, we all watched that happening. I remember ringing up the chief architect in Fingal County Council and saying, listen, you really need to come out and look at that site because there's such weird stuff going on. We can hear their spurs in the morning when the cowboys ride in on their horses. Would you not come and have a look at it? Because it was obvious to everybody that it was just a disaster. And he more or less said to me, what would somebody living in Moyclair, which is the estate, it's social housing, what would somebody in Moyclair know about architecture? So what do you do? Anyway, death of a field. The field itself is lost. The morning it becomes a site. When the notice goes up, Fingal County Council, 44 houses. The memory of the field is lost with the loss of its herbs. Though the wood pigeons in the willow, the finches in what's left of the hawthorn hedge, and the wagtail in the elder sing on their hungry summer song, the magpies sound like flying castanets. And the memory of the field disappears with its flora. Who can know the yearning of yarrow or the plight of the scarlet pimpernel, whose true colour is orange? The end of the field is the end of the hidey holes, where first smokes, first oaks, first gropes were had to the scentless mayweed. The end of the field as we know it is the start of the estate, the site to be planted with houses, each 2 or 3 bedroom, nest of sorrow and chemical, cargo of joy. The end of dandelion is the start of flash. The end of dock is the start of pledge. The end of teasel is the start of aerial. The end of primrose is the start of brillo. The end of thistle is the start of bounce. The end of slow is the start of oxyaction. The end of herb Robert is the start of brasso. The end of eyebright is the start of perso. Who amongst us is able to number the end of grasses, to number the losses of each seeding head? I'll walk out once barefoot under the moon to know the field through the soles of my feet, to hear the myriad leaf lives green and singing, the million cycles of being in wing, that before the field become map memory in some archive on some architect's screen, I might possess it or it possess me. Through its night dew, its moon-white call, its slick and shine, and its profligacy, difficult word, in every wing beat, in every beat of time.
This is the first poem in this book, but there are 2 epigraphs to this book, and one of them, I know one of the students drew attention to this one. One student drew attention to one of the epigraphs, which is, words cannot express truth. That which words express is not truth. Could you talk a bit more about your choice of that epigraph and the relationship of language and truth?
We have liftoff. Yeah. Better late than never. Yes, the epigraph from the Diamond Sutra, which is an ancient Buddhist text, which I first saw as a teenager in the Chester Beatty Library when it used to be out in the Shrewsbury Road, I think it was, where it was a kind of a hodgepodge of texts, and you could just ask for a text and they'd hand you this ancient Chinese text, which was, 6th century, beautiful illustrated manuscript. So yes, the epigraph, I suppose what I was getting at was the sense that, truth is such a, it's such a big word. Well, it's a small word, but it's such a fathomless, sometimes unfathomable idea. And we live in a time where truth is put under a lot of pressure, and we live in a culture where truth is a strange and slippery quantity. But it seems to be the writer's role, maybe the artist's role in general, certainly the poet's role, to speak truth. That's what it's about, truth and beauty. That's what it's always been about. And yet, how do you, as it were, as I think Louis MacNeice has it in a poem, the sunlight on the garden hardens and grows cold. How do we net its minutes within our nets of gold? Is it, how do we, that idea of how do you catch it? It's such a slippery thing. How do you speak truth? How do you speak truth, your own truth, and a truth that will somehow reach out and affect others, if that's not too big an ambition. But in the first instance, to speak your own complicated life and to tell the truth. And I think poems aren't necessarily biographical truth, they're not necessarily the truth in any literal way. But somewhere in the patterning and the design and the making of the poems, that's what you're after. You're trying to contain and transmit a truth. But when the Diamond Sutra says, words cannot express truth, that which words express is not truth, I think, I put that up as a challenge, because I actually think that is the aim, is to express truth, is to tell the truth. How do you do it, though, in language, with words whose meanings change? Even as we speak, the culture is changing the meaning of the words we use. And words have, I was very lucky to study the history of the English language with the great poet Elaine Ní Cuileanán in Trinity when I was an undergraduate. Through those studies, I realised that, in fact, the word itself, our word itself, it's so slippery. Its meaning changes depending on who uses it. What a word in one community can mean one thing, in another community another thing. So how do you actually make something that can contain truth with such a slippery, unreliable and extraordinary thing as language? One way for the poet to maybe get a sense of the word, of the truth in word, is to become very familiar with the words themselves, where they come from, what they mean, their etymology, their roots. And I write in English, which is the language of an empire. And everywhere the empire went, it hoovered up words. Every language they came in confrontation, because it was usually imperial confrontation, they sucked in. And of course, the roots of English itself go back into Latin and Greek and, Northern European languages. So you have this fantastic imperial language, which is totally suited for really writing about power relationships because of its imperial history. So to find a language within within the greater families of English that can express your truth seems to be the journey. I don't know that I've done it yet, you know. I think every new poem is a new engagement with that dilemma. How do you make those words your own? How do you nail them into a meaning that serves your ends?
One of the things you were talking about there was the process of learning. You mentioned Elaine Niquilnon. And one of the funniest poems in this book, I think, is the Teaching Kubla Khan to Force Trainees. And there's quite a lot of comedy, I think, in the collection as a whole. It pops up in there. But that seemed to me to be a really funny poem. And I was wondering, well, might you read it for us, or maybe talk a bit about teaching as an influence on your work?
Yeah. I suppose my earliest teaching was I did substitute teaching just after I graduated out in Coláiste de Dúlig, which was at the time I think the biggest school in the state, and I was teaching the remedial class there, and all I did was work on horses because the kids were horse mad, and some of them came to school on horses, so it was stories about horses, it was drawing horses, it was poetry about horses, it was actual, information about horses. And one of my abiding memories, because the kids used to smoke in the class, it wasn't where didn't have the energy or time to stop them. And it was my first time ever to engage in teaching. And it was fairly wild. But one of my abiding memories is I'm quite short-sighted. So I saw this smoke at the end of the class, and I assumed it was just someone having a fag. But then it started to flame up, and flames were coming from the desk. They'd managed to set a fire under the desk. And one of my visions, this was on the 3rd floor of the big new building, one of my visions of teaching in the system was this flaming desk being fecked out the window, sailing down. And so that was my emblem of the Irish education system for a long time. And then as I moved through life, I taught in many different situations. As a postgraduate student in America, I was thrown to the wolves to teach English 101. Any of you coming from the American system will recognise the perils of that. And that basically meant it was technically Teaching American English was the title of the course, right? And every single student in the university had to do it because it was basic research on basic grammar and structures and all that. But I didn't speak American English. I spoke a kind of a version of English as spoken in Dublin. So the students actually taught me American English. And that was a wonderful engagement. I loved it because I was teaching ballet dancers, wrestlers, English majors, because everybody had to do it. Science majors. I had a great time, and I learned so much about America and about American English. When I came back from that time in America as a graduate student in an MFA program, poetry was my subject, and I loved it. I was doing exactly what I loved. I came back in 1983 to 2 extraordinary transformations in this country. I left in 1981, and I came back 2 years later to a different country. The first thing was heroin had hit the poorer communities, including, the communities I had grown up in, where I'd spent my teenage years. Heroin had rolled through like a juggernaut. And that changed everything, because that generation of beautiful children who would be the class warriors were suddenly feckin' on the nod, dying, because along with intravenous use, needles came an AIDS epidemic amongst the poorer communities. That was one thing. The other thing that changed was the introduction of the 8th Amendment to the Constitution. So I came back as a young woman to a very different country. I started teaching in the communities, outside the systems, outside the institutions, though I would occasionally be, as this morning, a visitor to the university. But I mostly worked with people either in the prisons, women prisoners, political prisoners, other kinds of prisoners, and I worked in different community-based projects, which is where my interest, I think, lies. And, you know, out of those experiences have come many of the poems. So this is one of my favourite projects. It's a project called RAID, Recovery Through Art, Drama and Education. And all of the work within the project is based on working with practicing artists. So they make films, they write poems, they paint, they sculpt, they dance, and all with professional workers in the different fields. So it's a very, it's revolutionary in some ways. Every day starts with an hour of Tai Chi, which is an amazing way to settle the mind, especially people coming out of addiction, settle the mind, and it gives a couple of hours of really high quality attention. So this poem, Teaching Kubla Khan to the Foss, oops, the sound is going, maybe I'll stand back a bit. Teaching Kubla Khan to the Foss trainees at the Recovery Through Art, Drama and Education project. I should say I would try in those courses to use materials that have, you know, drug references or that talk about the drug experience. And of course, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and his generation were big into the old opium. And so anyway, it'll speak for itself. It's dedicated to Gerald Daw, who was a colleague at the time in Trinity College. He's retired since. They are most interested in the parts of Coleridge's notebooks where he writes of acrimony of the bowels, for he was a martyr to the constipation as a side effect of opiate use, and they, of course, would recognize the symptoms, one of the perils of heroin addiction. So he was full of shite, like all yous poets, full of it, full of yourselves. That's what they mean by writer's block. I wonder what he got off the man from Porlock. Knock, knock, me hole is blocked. We are soon in high merriment, all 20 of us, sitting in a circle, bags of shite, bags of bones, laughing our heads off, our clear and detoxed heads.